It only took almost 6 decades, but in 2013, the U.S. finally confessed. The CIA admitted that it was behind Iran's coup, finally owning up to its role in the 1953 operation that saw the overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, many think that the reason behind the enmity between the U.S. and Iran is due to the American embassy incidents involving American hostages, but this coup is one of the main problems that Iranians will never forget. In this edition of the debate, we'll ask why the U.S. calls Iran a supporter of terrorism when it has committed terrorist acts itself, in addition to coups.
On August 19, 1953, the United States Central Intelligence Agency, with the help of British government and through their puppets inside of Iran, waged a coup against the democratically elected government of then Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh had sought to limit the control of Britain's Anglo-Iranian oil company over the country's petroleum reserves. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil years after years of being under Britain's control. The move was supported by his nationalist party as well as religious figures led by prominent cleric Ayatollah Kashani. The initiative ended Britain's 4-decade rule over Iran's oil industry. In retaliation for the move, London and Washington imposed sanctions against Iran's oil industry and later planned a coup against the prime minister in a bid to reinstate the Western-backed monarch Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled Iran.
The British believed that control of Iranian oil was vital to reviving their economy, so it resorted to the United States, and the plot was carried out by the U.S. administration of Eisenhower. Official papers in the UK remain secret, but accounts of Britain's role in the coup are widespread.
General Zahedi led the movement, and the country fell into Zahedi's hands. The members of Mossadegh's cabinet either went to hiding or were put in jail. It was in March 2000 that for the first time the U.S. admitted its complicity in the coup known as the Operation Ajax.
The United States played a significant role in orchestrating the overthrow of Iran's popular Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and it is easy to see now why many Iranians continue to resent this intervention by America in their internal affairs.
The CIA also published a document in 2013 confirming Washington's role in the joint British-American overthrow of the Mossadegh administration. Washington benefited from removing Mossadegh as the coup once again paved the way for the U.S. political and economic presence in Iran, and it secured a significant share of the nation's oil revenues following the notorious coup. The Shah's dictatorship continued for 25 years after the coup and ended with the victory of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 when Iranians toppled the Shah's regime. Iran became a sovereign country and has resisted foreign domination ever since. But the 1953 coup continues to overshadow Iran-US relations. Over 6 decades after the coup, the incident has had a strong impact on relations between the two countries and a cause of mistrust in the US and its policies.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, author and historian Webster Tarpley, joins us from Washington. We have expert at Wikistrat, Richard Weitz, who also joins us from Washington. Gentlemen, welcome. Richard Weitz, I'll start with you. Please describe to us what this coup was all about.
Well, as you put it in context, thank you, we need to put it on context that this is in the early Cold War, 1950s. There were sort of different rules of the game of the international system. The British had control over Iranian oil as they had control over the petroleum assets of many countries. The government in Iran wanted to nationalize the oil and take control of it. The British objected. The Americans tried to mediate. The Prime Minister at the time, Mossadegh, and the Americans, the British, were not able to come to an agreement. The British argued that he was a Soviet agent, which I'm not sure if the Americans believed. They argued that the Iranians wouldn't be able to manage their own oil resources, which I think may have been believed. And there was concern that if Iran nationalized the British holdings there, other countries would follow, which was in fact the case. As you recall, in the following decades, all the Arab and Middle Eastern countries and elsewhere in the world nationalized pretty much their oil holdings. So the British saw what was coming, and the Americans, I think, agreed and tried to settle through negotiations. When that failed, is, from what the historical record shows, the U.S., the British, and others backed a coup to force the deposition of the elected prime minister and secure a more favorable settlement.
How would you describe that event, Webster Griffin Tarpley, in terms of the significance of it?
I would say it's rather more tragic than that. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt, the United States had assumed an anti-colonial posture. In other words, the U.S. was eager to promote the end of the British, French, and other colonial empires. With the death of Roosevelt, that unfortunately ended, and things passed into the hands of Truman and his foreign minister, his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. These people were observing the events in Iran, right? Mossadegh, a strong nationalist, came into power. He did some things for workers. He improved wages, working conditions in factories. He became very popular, of course, when he presided over the nationalization of this Anglo-Iranian oil company. And as far as that went, the United States was in some ways happy to see the British kicked out, because under the sort of fair treatment that Mossadegh was giving, the United States actually acquired part of this business. The problem came when Truman was replaced by Eisenhower, and when you had Eisenhower, you also had John Foster Dulles. I think John Foster Dulles is one of the central evil forces in this. Remember, this is a guy who had something to do with installing Hitler into power in Germany in the 1930s, but you had John Foster Dulles at the State Department, and of course his brother, Allen Dulles, at the CIA. And they were much more open to the British argument. I think the turning point was when Sir Winston Churchill seems to have convinced John Foster Dulles that Mossadegh was in fact a communist, and of course at that point in the hysteria and the neo-McCarthyism, or the McCarthyism in those days, the United States then shifted into the British column. So then we get this Operation Ajax of the US, Operation Boot of the British. In many ways, this is the model of the color revolution. In other words, this is the classic CIA people power coup, destabilization, using agents, and so forth. The prelude to the coup had been economic sanctions and indeed acts of war by the British. The British Royal Navy blockaded the Abadan refinery and tried to prevent all that oil from being exported, which meant that the living standards and the foreign exchange in Iran went way down. The British were even planning their own invasion of Abadan, which would have been a very dramatic event. So I would say it's a tragedy for Iran, because if this Mossadegh policy had been continued, the economics of Iran would have fared much better, and a 25-year nightmare under the Shah could have been avoided. At the same time, from the United States point of view, this is where the United States goes from being an anti-colonial power, at least to some degree, to being a total colonial power in its own right. So the road leads from Mossadegh to Saigon, Vietnam, and all the tragedies that came after that. So it's a terrible episode, and at the same time it shows us the roots long ago of the color revolutions that Washington still tries to pull today.
Well, one of the descriptions attributed to this Richard Weiss in terms of describing what had happened was called a military coup that overthrew Mossadegh, was carried out under CIA direction as an act of U.S. foreign policy. An act of U.S. foreign policy back in 1953. So that in itself is very significant, although it took the U.S. decades later, 6 decades later, in 2013, for the CIA to admit to the fact that it was behind Iran's coup. Why does the U.S. think that its foreign policy should have coups in it?
Well, again, I think our colleague is right. He put it in very much in historical context, what was going on. Now, I have not looked at the historical records of that period in respect to Iran. The historians who have, they do have a little bit of disagreement. There are some historians who argue that the coup plotting started under Truman. And so it would have been even before Dulles and so on that this occurred. I know that when we knew about this for many years now, I'm not sure what the significance of the CIA acknowledgement, but it was something historians had found already from some of the documents released by the State Department that the U.S. was involved. And again, putting this into context, early Cold War, these color revolutions, it was really the Nazis who started this whole process of fifth columns and propaganda and subversion of governments and so on. The Soviets carried it out in Eastern Europe. The Americans intervened, and I would argue, again, this starts under Truman in Greece and Turkey to prevent that. As you recall, the Americans intervened in 1946 when Stalin tried to take out Azerbaijan, the province of northern Azerbaijan, from Iran and incorporate it into Soviet Azerbaijan. And so this was in the context of an East-West struggle already over Iran. At that time, the nationalists were either underestimated or misinterpreted. I mean, they were seen as communist agents rather than genuine popular revolutionaries, which was most often not the case. And so in that context, that's why it happened. I don't, this is not something that the U.S. does now, these kind of coups. There are other things the U.S. does, but it's not these kind of, what was basically paying rioters to protest for and against Mossadegh, trying to convince the Shah, who didn't want to get involved, to do this. I mean, the U.S. doesn't really do this that way, this blatantly, and no countries just don't do that because this is a different era than we are now. So again, I'm glad we have a colleague who knows the area well and putting this in context, and I appreciate the program. I think it's very insightful.
Well, Webster, Gerson, Tarpley, I can see you have a reaction. Go ahead.
I have to disagree very strongly. As I say, the coup against Mossadegh is the direct ancestor. It's the father or the grandfather of the current color revolution. It's very similar to things that have been done under the heading of the Arab Spring, or indeed what was attempted in Iran in the summer of 2009. The People Power coup, the Rent-a-Mob, the group of golden youth in the public square, convincing the people that that's actually what everybody else thinks. And then, of course, at the same time, you've got generals who are bribed or threatened, and they go over to the side of the putschists and so forth. So I think this is the continuing problem. I've often said that we've been able to ban chemical warfare, at least for many countries. There's a ban on chemical warfare that seems to be, on the whole, respected. At least it was during World War II. But we have to come to a ban on color revolutions. In other words, on these interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. Takes that form too. The color revolution is really an act of war. The other thing I wanted to add, though, the figure who's most associated with this is Kermit Roosevelt, one of the top honchos of the CIA during the 1950s and the Cold War. Kermit Roosevelt seems to have been the guy on the ground who directed all these things. Now, I hasten to point out, the Roosevelt family has two sides, right? One is the Franklin D. Roosevelt side of Hyde Park, New York, and those are, in crude terms, the good guys. But then we have the Theodore Roosevelt group of Oyster Bay, Long Island, New York, and those are, in my view, the bad guys. Theodore Roosevelt and his grandson, I guess, Kermit Roosevelt. So you've got all of those. Also notice the fact that the United States goes to being the wrong side in Iran against Mossadegh sets up the situation where when Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal, the U.S. is still on the wrong side, and then that leads further on into Vietnam. So it's a resentment which then built up over 25 years. And whatever the Shah did, he could never get away from the fact that he had taken part in this rollback of the nationalization and bringing these foreigners back in so that they could, in effect, loot the oil wealth of Iran.
Well, this building of resentment perhaps can be reflected in what Iran's leader has said recently, but before we get to that, we're going to take a quick listen to some of the viewer comments on the topic of the subject as posted on the Facebook page, and then return back to the debate.
The U.S. thought the coup would break Iran's greatness and ability, but it made Iran stronger and wiser. Whatever doesn't kill you will make you stronger. The coup in Iran and the sanctions after the revolution have made Iran stronger, more stable and independent. The coup badly affected the life of Iranians. The US easily used Iran's natural resources and the military killed innocent civilians. Iran should distrust the people who run the US. Good for youngsters to know what happened in the 1950s. The coup terminated the first democracy in the Middle East. A fact never mentioned in US history classes: if the 1979 revolution would have never happened, the 1953 coup would have been looked as the US spreading its freedom and democracy to another oppressed land.
Some of the viewer comments there. I'd like to get your reaction, Richard Weiss, to what the U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, who visited Iran both before and after the coup, he said when Mossadegh and Persia started basic reforms, he called Iran Persia at that point, he said the U.S. became alarmed. We united with the British to destroy him. We succeeded. Ever since, our name has not been an honored one in the Middle East for the country's first democracy in the Middle East. Your reaction to that?
Well, it's true that some people saw his social reforms as an indication that he was sympathetic to communism. But I tend to agree with the discussion we've had so far that the main driver really was the oil and the British claim that we were going to lose possession of the oil from the West, and it would be either mismanaged by the Iranians or would encourage other countries nationally. I think that was the driving factor, and fear Soviets would benefit from the Cold War. It's possible the reforms played into that, but I think that was a lesser factor.
Well, Webster Griffin Tarpley, Iran's leader, recently made some statements regarding the U.S. after this nuclear conclusion, of course, saying that, we're going to do everything in our power, economically, politically, to stop the infiltration of the U.S. into Iran. And one of the things that obviously Iran's leader, perhaps indirectly, is never going to forget, just like many Iranians, is this coup that took place, obviously showing the duplicity of the United States in the way that they present themselves, obviously, to be I think we lost Webster Griffin Tarpley there. Yes, we did. All right, let's go to you, Richard Weiss. The resentment that's being built over the years, decades at this point, by Iranians regarding how the U.S. Participated in this coup and was one of the factors. This plays into the distrust, obviously, that plays between Iran and the U.S. Iran's leader, as I mentioned, has made some statements regarding the infiltration of the U.S., how it's going to stop that from happening. Don't you think that Iran has a right to feel this way, the coup being one of the reasons for that?
Well, that's a problem with this kind of approach. I mean, the Americans can cite, what the British did to them in colonial times. The French and the Germans can cite history. The key thing is to get beyond this. As far as we know, the Iranian people are less hostile to the United States than many other nations. The polls don't show the kind of hostility that we see, for example, in Pakistan towards Americans and American foreign policy. So it's good that, it's good to know about the history and try and manage it, but I wouldn't want to dwell on that. Not many people who were involved with that are still alive. It shouldn't be a defining factor of our relationship. I think there are much more important factors that we can look to. There are certainly strong coinciding interests between Iran and the United States, as well as strong areas in conflict. I wouldn't think that the history should be counted in either of those two categories. It's good to know, but it shouldn't really be a driving factor of today's world, which really is very different.
Well, Webster Griffin Tarpley, Richard White says that, but just as a week ago or 10 days ago, the U.S. President Barack Obama, in his speech at the American University, comes out and again not only says Iran is a supporter of terrorism, the all-option card still being played out. Why shouldn't Iran be extremely cautious, for lack of a better word, regarding any other types of movements that the U.S. might make after this nuclear conclusion, using that as a platform to exert whatever or to exercise whatever activities it wants?
I would simply like to preface the response to that with the observation that I've been able to make in Tehran, visiting Iran, in Qazvin, and in Shiraz, which is that at the level of people to people, ordinary people meeting in a park or something, the the American visitor is treated with tremendous hospitality, tremendous friendliness, curiosity, interest, and goodwill. But now at the level of governments, it looks somewhat different. It's not so much, I would say that people are still totally oriented towards an event all these years in the past. It's the fact that they're being constantly reminded. And these statements by Obama are very unfortunate, but you can see why he does this. This constant barrage of insults and accusations against Iran has to do with the fact that the nominal U.S. allies in the area, be it Saudi Arabia, be it Turkey, those really are the main organizing states of terrorism. So they're trying to divert attention from the fact that the Erdogan government in Turkey is essentially identical with ISIS. Those structures are really the same, and that Saudi Arabia is notorious for having funded all kinds of terrorists and fighters in Syria and in Libya and all around the Middle East. So it's a combination of a very bad historical precedent, right, which must be condemned every year and constantly. Combine that with the fact that this stuff still goes on. I think the irritant is what's going on in our own time.
Very well, we're going to have to end with that. Thank you very much for that. Author and historian Webster Griffin Tarpley from Washington with the statements, an expert at Wikistrat. Richard Weitz also spoke to us from Washington. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.